Chapter 1. The Empty Rectory. The autumn mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Hilda's Cross, a village so small it seemed to have been forgotten by time. Miss Jane Marple, with her soft white shawl and a knitted cap perched neatly on her silver hair, stepped off the morning bus with a quiet sense of purpose. She had been invited by her old friend, Mrs. Clara Winthrop, to spend a fortnight in the countryside. But as Miss Marple's keen eyes took in the huddled cottages and the ancient church spire piercing the fog, she sensed something amiss in the air, a faint undercurrent of unease. Mrs. Winthrop greeted her at the bus stop, her round face flushed with both excitement and anxiety. "Oh, Jane, I'm so glad you're here," she said, clutching Miss Marple's arm. "It's Father Gideon. He's gone." "Gone?" Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, her voice calm but curious. "Do you mean he's left the village?" "Nobody knows." Mrs. Winthrop's voice dropped to a whisper, as though the mist itself might overhear. "He was last seen Tuesday evening after evensong. By Wednesday morning, the rectory was empty, and his Bible was left open on his desk. To Exodus, of all things, thou shalt not kill. It's given everyone the shivers." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind already turning over the possibilities. "Perhaps we should see the rectory ourselves," she suggested, adjusting her shawl. "Details, Clara, are often more telling than rumours." The rectory was a modest stone house beside the church, its windows dark and its garden overgrown with late-season roses. Mrs. Winthrop led Miss Marple inside, where the air was heavy with the scent of old books and wax polish. In the study, a small oak desk stood beneath a leaded window. On it lay an open Bible, its pages yellowed but pristine, turned to Exodus 20:13. A single bookmark, embroidered with a cross, rested across the verse. Miss Marple leaned closer, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The desk was tidy, save for a half-finished cup of tea, now cold, and a fountain pen lying uncapped beside a blank sheet of paper. A chair was pushed back at an odd angle, as though its occupant had risen in haste. The fireplace was cold, but a faint trace of ash suggested a fire had burned recently. "No signs of a struggle," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. "And yet, something feels unfinished." Mrs. Winthrop wrung her hands. "The villagers are in a state, Jane. Father Gideon was well liked, but he could be stern. Some say he'd been acting strangely these past weeks. Distracted, secretive, and then there's the matter of the church funds." Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. "Church funds? Oh, nothing proven," Mrs. Winthrop said quickly. "Just talk. The collection plate's been lighter than usual, and Father Gideon was the only one with access to the safe. But surely he wouldn't—" "Let us not jump to conclusions," Miss Marple said gently, though her mind was already cataloguing the information. "People, like villages, often have hidden corners. We shall see what light can be shed." As they left the rectory, the church bell tolled noon, its mournful clang echoing through the mist. Miss Marple glanced at the ancient stone church, its doors slightly ajar. She had a feeling that St. Hilda's Cross, for all its sleepy charm, was hiding a secret, one that Father Gideon's disappearance had only begun to unravel. "Hold on, detective. Before we proceed, reveal your location. Where are you uncovering these dark truths? Comment below." And if you dare to dive deeper into the shadows, subscribe now. Tomorrow's case plunges into even deeper darkness. Stay vigilant. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Parish. The village of St. Hilda's Cross bustled quietly under the pale autumn sun, its residents going about their daily tasks with an air of forced normalcy. Miss Jane Marple, accompanied by Mrs. Winthrop, made her way to the village hall, where the parish women were preparing for the upcoming fete. The hall smelled of fresh-baked scones and strong tea, but the chatter was subdued, punctuated by furtive glances and hushed tones. Mrs. Winthrop introduced Miss Marple as my dear friend from St. Mary Mead, come to visit. And the women nodded, politely, though their eyes lingered with curiosity. Miss Marple, with her unassuming smile and knack for blending into any gathering, settled into a chair near the tea-urn, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened. The conversation soon turned to Father Gideon. Mrs. Elsie Tanner, a stout woman with a sharp tongue, was the first to speak. "It's unnatural, that's what it is," she declared, pinning a paper rosette to a banner. "A priest doesn't just vanish without a word. Mark my words, there's mischief afoot." "Perhaps he's gone on a retreat," suggested Miss Violet Crane, the organist, her voice timid. "He did seem troubled lately. I saw him pacing in the churchyard last week, muttering to himself." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. "Troubled, you say?" she asked, her tone mild but encouraging. Miss Crane hesitated, then nodded. "He wasn't himself. Usually so composed, but lately he'd snap at the choir if we missed a note. And he stopped visiting the sick, which wasn't like him at all." Mrs. Winthrop leaned forward. "What about young Tommy Price? He was Father Gideon's altar boy. Did he notice anything odd?" Mrs. Tanner snorted. "That lad's too busy chasing skirts to notice much. But I heard he and the father had words last Sunday. Something about Tommy being careless with the vestments." Miss Marple made a mental note. Young men, in her experience, often saw more than they let on, especially when they were trying to avoid trouble. "And what of the church warden, Mr. Hargreaves?" she asked, recalling Mrs. Winthrop's mention of the church funds. The room grew quieter. Mrs. Tanner pursed her lips. "Albert Hargreaves is a good man, but he's been prickly since the collection plate started coming up short. He questioned Father Gideon about it right in front of the vestry. Not that it did any good." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to a woman in the corner who had yet to speak. Mrs. Lydia Blackwood, a widow with a pale, drawn face, was arranging flowers with meticulous care. Her hands trembled slightly, and she avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Miss Marple's instincts stirred. Grief, she knew, could mask many things: guilt, fear, or knowledge. As the meeting broke up, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Blackwood. "Your flowers are lovely," she said kindly. "They must bring such comfort to the church." Mrs. Blackwood's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Father Gideon always said they brightened the altar. He was kind to me after my husband passed." "I'm sure he was," Miss Marple said softly. "It must be hard with him missing." The widow's eyes flickered with something, fear, perhaps, before she looked away. "Yes," she whispered, "very hard." As Miss Marple and Mrs. Winthrop left the hall, the older woman's knitting bag swung lightly at her side. The village was a tapestry of secrets, she thought, each thread leading to another. Father Gideon's disappearance was no simple matter of a man wandering off. There was intent here and perhaps danger. She resolved to visit the church next, to see what else the stones of St. Hilda's Cross might reveal. Chapter 3. The Clue in the Choir. Loft, the church of St. Hilda's Cross, stood at the heart of the village, its weathered stones bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon. Miss Jane Marple pushed open the heavy oak door, her footsteps echoing in the cool, shadowed nave. Mrs. Winthrop had stayed behind to help with fete preparations, leaving Miss Marple to explore alone, a circumstance she rather preferred, as it allowed her sharp mind to work undisturbed. The interior was as serene as one might expect, with rows of polished pews and stained glass windows casting jewelled light across the flagstones. Yet Miss Marple's keen eyes noted details others might overlook. A hymnal left open on a pew, a faint scuff mark near the altar, and a single candle half burned that seemed out of place on the lectern. She made her way to the choir loft, prompted by Miss Crane's mention of Father Gideon's irritability with the singers. The loft was a narrow, creaky space overlooking the nave, its benches cluttered with sheet music and a few forgotten prayer books. Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small wooden box tucked beneath the organist's stool, its lid slightly ajar. She knelt carefully, her knees not being what they once were, and opened it. Inside was a collection of oddments, a broken rosary, a crumpled letter, and most curiously, a brass key with an ornate handle. The letter was addressed to Father Gideon in a hurried scrawl, unsigned but dated 2 weeks prior. It read, "You cannot keep silent forever. Meet me at the crypt, midnight Tuesday." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Tuesday night was when Father Gideon had last been seen. The crypt, she recalled, was beneath the church, accessible only through a locked door behind the altar. Could the key in the box fit that lock? She pocketed the letter and key, intending to examine them further, when a faint noise, a soft thud, came from below. Moving quietly to the edge of the loft, she peered down. A figure stood near the altar, partially obscured by a pillar. It was Tommy Price, the altar boy, his hands fidgeting as he glanced nervously around. He bent to pick up something from the floor, a small glinting object, and slipped it into his pocket before hurrying out. Miss Marple descended the stairs with care, her mind racing. Tommy's presence in the church so soon after the parish meeting was no coincidence. And what had he found? A coin, perhaps, or something more incriminating. She approached the spot where he'd stood and noticed a faint chalk mark on the flagstone, partially smudged. It resembled an arrow pointing toward the door to the crypt. The crypt door was old and iron-bound, its lock rusted but intact. Miss Marple tested the key from the box, and it turned with a satisfying click. She hesitated, aware that venturing into a dark, possibly dangerous place was not entirely sensible for a woman of her years. Yet her curiosity, tempered by caution, won out. She pushed the door open, revealing a steep stone staircase descending into shadow. The air grew colder as she descended, her hand steady on the rough wall. At the bottom, the crypt was a low, vaulted chamber, its walls lined with ancient tombs. A single lantern hung from a hook, unlit but recently used, judging by the wax drippings on the floor. And there, in the corner, was a pile of disturbed earth, as though someone had been digging. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was no mere disappearance. The crypt held secrets, and the clue in the choir loft had led her to them. She retraced her steps, locking the door behind her. Tommy Price, the letter, the key, and now the disturbed earth. All were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to foul play. She would need to tread carefully, for St. Hilda's Cross was no longer the sleepy village it seemed. Chapter 4. The Widow's Tale. The following morning, Miss Jane Marple sat in Mrs. Winthrop's cosy parlour, a cup of tea balanced on her knee, as she recounted her findings in the church. She omitted the details of the crypt for now, sensing that Mrs. Winthrop's nerves were already frayed. Instead, she focused on the letter and the key, her voice calm but laced with the quiet authority of one who had unravelled many a mystery. "We must speak with Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Marple concluded, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "She knows more than she's let on, Clara. Grief can be a mask, but it rarely hides everything." Mrs. Winthrop nodded, though her eyes widened. "Lydia Blackwood. She's such a quiet soul. Do you really think she's involved?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that she is afraid. And fear often stems from knowledge." The two women set out for Mrs. Blackwood's cottage, a small ivy-covered house at the edge of the village. The widow was in her garden, pruning roses with a pair of shears that seemed too heavy for her frail hands. She looked up as they approached, her pale face tightening with apprehension. "Good morning, Lydia," Mrs. Winthrop called, her tone overly bright. "Jane wanted to see your lovely garden. May we come in?" Mrs. Blackwood hesitated, then nodded, setting the shears aside. "Of course," she said softly, leading them into a tidy sitting room. The air smelled of lavender, and a framed photograph of a stern-looking man, presumably her late husband, stood on the mantel. Miss Marple wasted no time on pleasantries. "Mrs. Blackwood," she began, her voice kind but direct, "I couldn't help but notice your distress yesterday at the parish meeting. Father Gideon's disappearance has upset us all, but I sense it weighs particularly heavily on you. Bokuk, there's something you'd like to share." The widow's hands twisted in her lap, and for a moment it seemed she might remain silent. Then, with a shuddering breath, she spoke. He came to me 2 weeks ago, Father Gideon. It was late, after dark. He was different, agitated. He said he'd done something terrible, years ago, before he came to St. Hilda's Cross." Monsieur Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained serene. "Did he say what it was?" Mrs. Blackwood shook her head. "He wouldn't tell me, only that it was a sin he couldn't confess, not even to God. He said someone had, found out, someone who was threatening him. He begged me to pray for him, and then he left. I never saw him again." Mrs. Winthrop gasped, but Miss Marple merely nodded, as though fitting a piece into a puzzle. "Did he mention a name, or anything about this person?" "No," Mrs. Blackwood whispered, "but there was a letter. He was clutching it when he came. I didn't see what it said, but it was in a woman's handwriting. I thought it might be from someone in the village." Miss Marple's mind flashed to the crumpled letter from the choir loft, unsigned but written in a hurried scrawl. Could it be the same one? And if so, who in St. Hilda's Cross had known Father Gideon's secret and used it against him? "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Marple said, rising. You've been most helpful. Try not to worry. These things have a way of coming to light. As they left the cottage, Mrs. Winthrop clutched Miss Marple's arm. Jane, do you think Father Gideon was blackmailed, and by a woman? It's possible, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. But secrets, Clara, are like weeds. They spread far beyond one person. I believe we should speak with young Tommy Price next. He may have seen something or someone that night in the church. The sun dipped behind the church spire, casting long shadows across the village. Miss Marple's steps were light, but her mind was heavy with possibilities. Mrs. Blackwood's tale had opened a door to Father Gideon's past, and somewhere in that past lay the key to his disappearance, and perhaps his fate. Chapter 5. Shadows at the Vicarage. The evening air was crisp as Miss Jane Marple walked the short distance to the vicarage, her shawl drawn tightly against the chill. Mrs. Winthrop had offered to accompany her, but Miss Marple preferred to approach Tommy Price alone. Young men, she knew, were more likely to speak freely without an audience, especially one as prone to exclamations as Clara Winthrop. The vicarage, adjacent to the rectory, was home to the churchwarden, Mr. Albert Hargreaves, and his family, including Tommy, who lodged there while serving as altar boy. Miss Marple knocked softly, and the door was opened by Mrs. Hargreaves, a wiry woman with a pinched expression. "Miss Marple," she said, surprised, "what brings you here so late?" "I was hoping to have a word with Tommy," Miss Marple said with her usual disarming smile. "A small matter about the church. Nothing to trouble you." Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated, then called over her shoulder, "Tommy! Visitor!" She ushered Miss Marple into a cluttered parlour, where a fire crackled in the grate. Tommy Price appeared, a lanky lad of 17 with tousled hair and a wary look in his eyes. He slouched against the doorframe, hands in his pockets. "What's this about, then?" he asked, his tone more curious than defensive. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side. "I saw you in the church yesterday, Tommy," she said gently, "near the altar, picking something up. I wondered if you might share what it was. It could be important, you know, with Father Gideon missing." Tommy's face flushed, and he shifted uncomfortably. "Didn't pick up nothing," he mumbled. "Just dropped my hymn book is all." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet amusement. "My dear boy, I've known many a young man, and none of them were quite so clumsy as to drop a hymn book and then pocket it. Come now, what did you find?" Tommy glanced toward the door, ensuring his aunt was out of earshot, then sighed. "All right, but don't tell no one." It was a ring. Gold, with a funny mark on it, like a cross, but twisted. "I found it under the altar cloth. Thought it might be worth something." "May I see it?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but firm. Reluctantly, Tommy fished the ring from his pocket and handed it over. Miss Marple examined it closely. The band was indeed gold, engraved with a peculiar symbol, a cross with a serpentine flourish. It was no ordinary piece of jewellery, and its presence beneath the altar suggested it had been dropped in haste or deliberately hidden. "Did you see anyone else in the church that night?" Miss Marple pressed, handing the ring back. "Tuesday, after evensong?" Tommy hesitated, then lowered his voice. I wasn't supposed to be there, see? I went back to fetch my cap, and I saw someone leaving the rectory. It was dark, but they were moving quick, like they didn't want to be seen. Couldn't tell who it was. Just a shadow, really. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the information. Thank you, Tommy. You've been most helpful. Keep that ring safe, and don't speak of it to anyone just yet. As she left the vicarage, the village was cloaked in darkness, the only light coming from the church's stained glass windows, faintly glowing. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the ring's strange symbol. It reminded her of something. A memory from her youth, perhaps, of a scandal involving a secret society. And the shadow Tommy saw, could it be the same person who wrote the letter, or someone else entirely? She resolved to visit the church again, to examine the altar more closely. The ring, the letter, the disturbed earth in the crypt, all were threads in a tapestry of deceit. And Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, knew that the shadow at the vicarage was only the beginning. Chapter 6. The Locked Room Riddle. The morning mist had barely lifted when Miss Jane Marple returned to the church of St. Hilda's Cross, her umbrella tucked under her arm as a precaution against the drizzle. The village was stirring, but the church was silent, its heavy door yielding to her gentle push. She had come to investigate the altar where Tommy had found the ring, but her thoughts kept drifting to the crypt and the mysterious pile of disturbed earth she had seen there. Miss Marple moved quietly to the altar, her sharp eyes scanning the polished wood and crisp linen cloth. She lifted the cloth carefully, revealing nothing but the smooth stone beneath. Yet the ring's presence here, coupled with Tommy's sighting of a shadowy figure, suggested the altar was more than a sacred space. It was a stage for secrets. Her attention shifted to the crypt door behind the altar. The brass key from the choir loft, still in her possession, felt heavy in her pocket. She approached the door, its iron hinges cold under her touch, and turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open, revealing the same steep staircase descending into darkness. This time she had brought a small torch, borrowed from Mrs. Winthrop's kitchen, and its beam cut through the gloom as she descended. The crypt was as she remembered, low, vaulted and lined with ancient tombs. The lantern still hung from its hook, and the pile of disturbed earth remained in the corner, untouched since her last visit. But now, with the torch's light, she noticed something new. A faint outline in the stone wall beside the earth, barely visible. It was a door, cunningly disguised to blend with the surrounding masonry, its edges marked by a thin layer of dust. Miss Marple's heart quickened. A hidden door in a crypt was no ordinary feature. She pressed against it, but it didn't budge. There was a keyhole, smaller than the one for the crypt door, and her brass key was too large to fit. Frustrated but undeterred, she examined the surrounding area. The disturbed earth, she realized, was not random. It had been moved to conceal the door's base, perhaps to obscure recent use. Kneeling carefully, she sifted through the loose soil with her gloved hands. Her fingers brushed against something hard, a small metal object buried shallowly. It was a key, smaller and simpler than the one from the choir loft, its head etched with the same serpentine cross symbol as the ring Tommy had found. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. The pieces were falling into place, though the picture they formed was still murky. She tested the new key in the hidden door's lock. It turned smoothly, and the door swung inward with a low groan. revealing a narrow passage that sloped downward. The air was damp and stale, and the torch's beam showed rough-hewn walls, suggesting the passage was far older than the church above. Miss Marple hesitated. Venturing into an unknown tunnel was risky, but her curiosity and her sense of duty to uncover the truth urged her forward. The passage led to a small chamber, barely large enough for 2 people to stand. In the centre was a wooden chest, its lid locked with a rusty padlock. Scratched into the chest's surface was the same serpentine cross. Miss Marple's torch flickered, casting eerie shadows, and she suddenly felt the weight of the silence. This was no mere storage room. It was a place of secrets, perhaps tied to Father Gideon's past and his disappearance. She retraced her steps, locking the hidden door and pocketing the second key. The chest would have to wait. She needed more information before tampering with it. As she emerged into the crypt, she heard a faint noise above, like the scuff of a shoe on stone. Someone was in the church. Moving swiftly for a woman of her years, she ascended the stairs, locked the crypt door, and slipped behind a pillar just as the church door creaked open. Through the shadows, she glimpsed a figure, too tall to be Tommy, too slight to be Mr. Hargreaves. It was Miss Violet Crane, the organist, her face pale as she glanced nervously around. She approached the altar, hesitated, then lifted the cloth, searching for something. Finding nothing, she let out a small, frustrated sigh and hurried out. Miss Marple remained still, her mind racing. The locked room in the crypt, the chest, the keys, and now Miss Crane's furtive search. All pointed to a conspiracy deeper than she had imagined. Father Gideon's disappearance was no accident, and the riddle of the locked room held the key to his fate. Chapter 7. The Village Fete. The annual St. Hilda's Cross Fete was in full swing, transforming the village green into a kaleidoscope of colour and sound. Stalls lined the grass, offering homemade jams, knitted scarves, and games of hoopla, while children darted about, clutching toffee apples. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a tea stall with Mrs. Winthrop, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness, her knitting needles clicking as her eyes missed nothing. The festive air was strained, however. Father Gideon's absence hung over the village like a cloud, and whispers of his disappearance mingled with the clink of teacups. Miss Marple's discoveries in the crypt, the hidden door, the chest, and the serpentine cross had sharpened her focus. She was certain the fete, with its gathering of villagers, would reveal more threads in the tapestry of the mystery. Mrs. Winthrop, pouring tea, leaned close. "Jane, do you think the fete will go off without a hitch? Everyone's so on edge. People often reveal themselves under pressure," Miss Marple replied softly, her gaze settling on Miss Violet Crane, who was arranging hymnals at a bookstall. The organist's nervous demeanour in the church the previous day had not gone unnoticed. Nearby, Tommy Price lounged by a coconut shy, his eyes darting toward the church every so often. And there, at the flower stall, was Mrs. Blackwood, her pale face half hidden behind a bouquet of roses. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a heated exchange near the cake stall. Mr. Albert Hargreaves, the church warden, was speaking sharply to Mrs. Elsie Tanner, whose voice carried over the crowd. "I'm telling you, Albert, the accounts don't add up. Father Gideon was supposed to balance them, and now he's gone. Convenient, isn't it?" Hargreaves's face reddened. "Mind your tongue, Elsie. You've no proof of anything." Miss Marple's needles paused. The missing church funds, mentioned earlier by Mrs. Winthrop, were clearly a sore point. Could they be tied to the chest in the crypt, or to the threatening letter Father Gideon had received? She made a mental note to examine the church accounts, if possible. As the afternoon wore on, a tug-of-war game began, drawing a crowd. Tommy Price was among the participants, pulling on the rope with more enthusiasm than skill. During the chaos, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Blackwood slip away from her stall, moving toward the church. Excusing herself from the tea stall, Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her umbrella serving as both prop and pretext. Mrs. Blackwood entered the church, leaving the door slightly ajar. Miss Marple waited a moment, then slipped inside, keeping to the shadows of the nave. The widow stood near the crypt door, her hands trembling as she fumbled with something. A piece of paper, folded tightly. She glanced around, then tucked it beneath the altar cloth before hurrying out. Miss Marple approached the altar and retrieved the paper. It was a note, written in a shaky hand. "I know what you did. The chest must stay hidden, or I'll tell." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting matched the letter from the choir loft. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Mrs. Blackwood was either a victim of fear or a player in a dangerous game. As she pocketed the note, a shout from outside broke the silence. The tug-of-war had ended in a scuffle, and Tommy Price was at the centre, nursing a bruised cheek. Miss Marple emerged to find Mr. Hargreaves pulling Tommy aside, his voice low but stern. "You've been careless, lad. Keep your mouth shut, or you'll regret it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The fete, with its forced cheer, had exposed cracks in the village's facade. Mrs. Blackwood's note, Hargreaves' warning to Tommy, and Miss Crane's furtive behaviour all pointed to a shared secret, one tied to the crypt and Father Gideon's fate. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple resolved to decipher the clue in the Bible itself, sensing it held the key to unravelling the truth. Chapter 8. The truth in the text. The rectory was quiet as Miss Jane Marple sat at Father Gideon's desk, the open Bible before her, its pages still turned to Exodus 20:13. "Thou shalt not kill." The late afternoon light filtered through the leaded windows, casting a soft glow on the embroidered bookmark and the uncapped fountain pen, untouched since the priest's disappearance. Miss Marple's discoveries at the fete, Mrs. Blackwood's note, Mr. Hargreaves' warning to Tommy, and the undercurrent of village tension had convinced her that the Bible held more than spiritual guidance. It was a clue, deliberately left. She examined the bookmark closely. Its cross, stitched in gold thread, bore a faint resemblance to the serpentine symbol on the ring and the key from the crypt. Turning the bookmark over, she noticed a series of tiny pinpricks along the edge, barely visible. Her heart quickened. In her youth, she had known a governess who used pinpricks to encode messages in books, a simple but effective cipher. Could Father Gideon have done the same? Miss Marple took a sheet of paper and a pencil, carefully noting the position of each pinprick. There were 7 in total, each corresponding to a letter when mapped to the alphabet, CRYPTOS. The word was cryptos, Greek for hidden. A hidden message, indeed. She turned back to the Bible, her fingers tracing the verse. The text itself seemed unremarkable, but the pinpricks suggested a code within the page. She scanned the surrounding verses looking for patterns. In Exodus 20, the 10 commandments were listed, each verse a command. She counted the words in verse 13, "Thou shalt not kill," and found 4. But when she counted the words in the chapter, starting from verse 1, and stopped at the 7th pinprick's position, she landed on a different phrase in verse 15, "Thou shalt not steal." The missing church funds, whispered about by Mrs. Tanner, came to mind. Was the code pointing to theft as well as murder? To test her theory, Miss Marple examined the Bible's margins. There, in faint pencil, almost erased, was a notation, Psalm 32:5. She flipped to the psalm, which spoke of confession and forgiveness. "I acknowledged my sin unto thee, and mine iniquity have I not hid." The words resonated with Mrs. Blackwood's story of Father Gideon's late-night visit, confessing a terrible sin from his past. The Bible, Miss Marple realized, was not just a clue. It was Father Gideon's attempt to leave a trail. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the rectory door. Mrs. Winthrop entered, her face flushed. "Jane, you'll never believe it. Miss Crane just told me she saw Father Gideon the night he vanished, arguing with someone in the churchyard. She wouldn't say who, but she's frightened. Says she's been getting strange notes." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Notes, you say? Like the one I found under the altar?" Mrs. Winthrop gasped. "You don't think Miss Crane wrote it?" "No," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "but I think she knows who did. The Bible points to a hidden truth, Clara, and I believe it's tied to the chest in the crypt. Father Gideon was trying to confess something, perhaps to protect someone or to expose them." She closed the Bible, slipping the bookmark into her knitting bag. The pinpricks, the psalm, and the word cryptos all pointed to the crypt's hidden chamber. The chest, with its serpentine cross, held the answer. Whether it was evidence of Father Gideon's sin, the missing funds, or something far darker. But Miss Marple knew she couldn't open it alone. The village was watching, and the person sending notes was growing bolder. "We must tread carefully," she said, rising. "Tomorrow I shall gather those involved, Mrs. Blackwood, Miss Crane, Tommy, and Mr. Hargreaves. The truth is close, Clara, and I believe the church itself will help us uncover it." As they left the rectory, the church bell tolled, its mournful sound echoing through the dusk. Miss Marple's mind was alight with possibilities. But one thing was certain. The truth in the text was about to unravel the mystery of St. Hilda's Cross. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. The church of St. Hilda's Cross was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight as Miss Jane Marple stood at the altar, her frail figure commanding the attention of the gathered villagers. It was evening, and she had requested the presence of those most entwined in Father Gideon's disappearance: Mrs. Lydia Blackwood, Miss Violet Crane, Tommy Price, and Mr. Albert Hargreaves. Mrs. Winthrop stood by the door, her eyes wide with anticipation, while a few curious parishioners lingered in the pews, sensing something momentous was afoot. Miss Marple's voice was steady, her tone gentle but firm. "Thank you for coming," she began, her hands resting on the open Bible. "From the rectory. Father Gideon's absence has cast a shadow over St. Hilda's Cross, but I believe the truth lies within our grasp. It is time to bring it to light." Mrs. Blackwood clutched a handkerchief, her face pale. Miss Crane fidgeted with her gloves, avoiding eye contact. Tommy slouched in a pew, his bruised cheek still visible from the fate's scuffle, while Mr. Hargreaves stood stiffly, his jaw tight. Miss Marple's keen eyes missed none of these signs of unease. "Let us begin with the Bible," she said, gesturing to the open page. "It was left on Exodus 20:13. Thou shalt not kill. A deliberate croft. I found a code in the bookmark, pointing to cryptos, hidden." It led me to Psalm 32:5, a confession of sin. Father Gideon was trying to tell us something about a sin from his past, one he could not hide. Mrs. Blackwood gasped, her handkerchief trembling. Miss Marple continued, "Mrs. Blackwood, you told me Father Gideon confessed to a terrible deed, and that someone was threatening him. I believe that person was here, in this village, and they used his secret to blackmail him." She produced the note from the altar cloth. "This note, left by you, Mrs. Blackwood, warned of a chest in the crypt that must stay hidden. But you were not the blackmailer. You were afraid, protecting someone else." Mrs. Blackwood sobbed. "It was my late husband, John. Years ago, he and Father Gideon were involved in a theft in another parish. They stole church relics, sold them to a collector. Father Gideon came here to atone, but John kept the secret to control him. After John died, I found his letters, threatening to expose Father Gideon unless he paid." Miss Marple nodded. "But someone else discovered this secret. Miss Crane, you saw Father Gideon arguing in the churchyard, and you've been receiving notes. You searched the altar, looking for the ring Tommy found, a ring with a serpentine cross tied to the theft." Miss Crane's face crumpled. I didn't mean harm. I found a letter in the organ, addressed to Father Gideon, demanding money. I thought if I found the ring, I could stop it. I was scared." Miss Marple turned to Tommy. "Tommy, you saw a figure leaving the rectory that night. You also found the ring, dropped by someone in haste. That someone was you, Mr. Hargreaves." Hargreaves' eyes widened. "That's preposterous." "Is it?" Miss Marple said calmly. "You were furious about the missing church funds. But you weren't just a victim. You found John Blackwood's letters in the church safe, where Father Gideon had hidden them. You continued the blackmail, demanding he siphon funds to you. When he refused to pay more, you confronted him in the rectory. In a struggle, you struck him, and he fell, dead. The church was silent, save for Mrs. Blackwood's sobs." Miss Marple continued. "You hid his body in the crypt's hidden chamber, in the chest marked with the serpentine cross, hoping to make it seem he'd fled. But you dropped the ring, and the Bible's message betrayed you." Hargreaves' face twisted. "You've no proof." "The chest in the crypt will provide it," Miss Marple said. "I've asked the constable to examine it tonight. You cannot hide forever, Mr. Hargreaves." Hargreaves lunged for the door, but Tommy and several parishioners blocked him. The constable, summoned by Mrs. Winthrop, entered, and Hargreaves was led away, his protests echoing in the nave. Miss Marple closed the Bible. Father Gideon sought forgiveness, but human greed undid him. Let us pray for his soul, and for healing in St. Hilda's Cross. Chapter 10. The Quiet Resolution. The morning sun broke through the mist over St. Hilda's Cross, casting a gentle light on the village green, now cleared of the Fates' stalls and banners. Miss Jane Marple sat on a bench outside Mrs. Winthrop's cottage, her knitting bag at her side, a cup of tea warming her hands. The events of the previous night in the church had left the village subdued, but there was a sense of relief. As though a long-held breath had finally been released, Mrs. Winthrop joined her face still etched with the shock of Mr. Hargreaves's confession. "Jane, I can scarcely believe it," she said, settling beside her friend. "Albert Hargreaves, of all people! To think he could do such a thing to poor Father Gideon." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with a sad smile. "Human nature, Clara, is often a tangle of good and ill. Mr. Hargreaves was a respectable man, but greed and desperation can lead even the upright astray. Father Gideon's past gave him the means, and the church funds gave him the motive." The constable's search of the crypt had confirmed Miss Marple's deductions. The chest in the hidden chamber contained Father Gideon's body, along with a cache of old letters detailing his and John Blackwood's theft years ago. Hargreaves, upon discovering the letters, had blackmailed the priest, draining the church funds until Father Gideon, tormented by guilt and unwilling to continue, confronted him. In a moment of rage, Hargreaves had struck him, and the blow proved fatal. The Bible, left open to "thou shalt not kill," was Father Gideon's final act of confession, a plea for the truth to be found. Mrs. Winthrop shook her head. And Mrs. Blackwood? Miss Crane? They were caught up in it too. "Fear and loyalty," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Blackwood protected her husband's memory, and later Father Gideon's, by hiding what she knew. Miss Crane, poor soul, was frightened into silence by the notes Hargreaves sent to keep her quiet. Even young Tommy played his part, though unwittingly, by finding the ring. The serpentine cross, Miss Marple had learned, was the mark of a secretive group of relic, traders Father Gideon and John Blackwood had dealt with in their youth. The ring and key were relics of that past, dropped by Hargreaves in his panic to cover his crime. The village, now aware of the full story, was grappling with its own complicity in ignoring the signs of discord. "What will happen now?" "Mrs." Winthrop asked. "The parish is without a priest, and the church feels tainted." "Time heals, Clara," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking rhythmically. "A new priest will come, and the church will stand as it always has. People are resilient, and St. Hilda's Cross is no exception. They will learn to forgive not just Hargreaves, but themselves." As the church bell tolled, Miss Marple rose, adjusting her shawl. Her bus back to St. Mary Mead was due soon, and she had no wish to overstay her welcome. She took a final look at the village, the cottages, the green, the ancient spire, and felt a quiet satisfaction. The mystery was solved, the truth laid bare, but her thoughts lingered on Father Gideon, a man who sought redemption and found it in his way through the truth. "Will you come back, Jane?" Mrs. Winthrop asked, her voice hopeful. Miss Marple smiled. "If St. Hilda's Cross has need of me, perhaps. But for now, I think my garden in St. Mary Mead is calling." With a wave, she made her way to the bus stop, her steps light despite the weight of what she had uncovered. The village would mend as villages do, and Miss Marple, ever the observer of human nature, would carry its story with her. A reminder that even in the quietest places, secrets cannot stay hidden forever. Epilogue: The Light of St. Hilda's Cross. 3 months had passed since Miss Jane Marple's departure from St. Hilda's Cross, and the village had begun to heal as she had predicted. The winter frost now dusted the cobblestones, and the church of St. Hilda's Cross stood adorned with holly and candles for the Christmas season. Miss Marple, back in her cosy cottage in St. Mary Mead, received a letter from Mrs. Winthrop, its pages filled with the village's latest news. The new priest, Father Thomas, was a young man with a gentle demeanour and a knack for bringing people together. His first sermon, Mrs. Winthrop wrote, had been on forgiveness, and the congregation had listened with a quiet intensity, as though cleansing the air of past sins. The church funds, depleted by Mr. Hargreaves' actions, were slowly being restored through generous donations from the parish, and the crypt's hidden chamber had been sealed, its secrets laid to rest with Father Gideon. Mrs. Lydia Blackwood had found solace in her garden, her roses now a symbol of renewal. She had begun teaching the village children to arrange flowers for the altar, a small act that brought her out of her shell. Miss Violet Crane, freed from the fear of anonymous notes, had composed a new hymn for the church, its melody haunting yet hopeful. Tommy Price, chastened by his brush with the mystery, had taken his duties as altar boy more seriously, though his cheeky grin remained. Mr. Hargreaves, awaiting trial, had confessed fully to the authorities, his remorse evident in his willingness to return what remained of the stolen funds. The village, though shaken, had chosen not to shun his family, and Mrs. Hargreaves was often seen at the parish meetings, her head held high despite the whispers. Mrs. Winthrop's letter ended with a personal note. "Jane, we owe you so much. Your quiet wisdom lit a path through our darkness. The church bell rings clearer now, and I think Father Gideon would be at peace knowing his truth was told. Do visit us again. St. Hilda's Cross will always have a place for you." Miss Marple folded the letter, her eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. She rose to tend her garden, where the first snowdrops were pushing through the frost. As she snipped a sprig of rosemary, her thoughts drifted to St. Hilda's Cross, not to the mystery but to the people. They had faced their shadows and emerged into the light, as people often do when given a chance. She glanced at her knitting bag, where the embroidered bookmark from Father Gideon's Bible now rested, a keepsake of her time in the village. Its serpentine cross no longer held menace, only memory. Miss Marple smiled faintly, knowing that wherever there were people, there would be stories, and she would always be ready to listen.